A barely audible rumble, at first resembling the distant thunder of a storm, then quickly turning into an insistent, unbearably alien buzzing, broke the stone silence of the mountain taiga.
Ivan Andreevich Belov, nicknamed Raven, did not even raise his head. He sat on a log by a slightly smoldering fire, tossing 3 dry cedar cones into it, and cleaned an old hunting knife with a moose horn handle. The knife was the only object he cherished and nurtured with almost religious care, for it was an extension of his hand, his senses, his justice.
At Ivan's ankle, curled up in a tight, inconspicuous ball of dark fur, lay Shadow, a West Siberian Laika, his constant companion, and the only creature he trusted unconditionally.
The dog raised its head, opening its amber eye for a moment,
and let out a low, barely audible growl, which was more an expression of discontent than a warning of danger. "Calm down, old boy. It's not you," came Raven's low, hoarse voice. He spoke slowly, as if weighing each word on the scales of silence, not wanting to disturb the balance of sound in the forest. The helicopter seemed to have flown in from another dimension, from the bustling, asphalt-covered life that Ivan had left behind about 10 years ago, after he was fired from his position as senior state inspector of the Scion Nature Reserve for standing too firmly in the way of an influential official. Since then, he had lived here, on the farmstead, working as a freelance search and rescue consultant and survival instructor, and was the only person the local police turned to when a criminal's trail led off the road into the living, breathing Taiga. For him, this territory was not a map or a resource, but a whole organism. And he, Voron, was its nerve ending, sensing every painful or alien intrusion. The machine, resembling a black, clumsy bumblebee, descended heavily onto a small clearing, raising a whirlwind of dust, pine needles, and dry leaves. The smell of kerosene instantly mixed with the clean, resinous air, and the combination hit Ivan like a slap in the face. It was the smell of foreign blood in his world. Senior Lieutenant Mayorov, a man of about 35, too clean and too neat for this place, emerged from the helicopter, slightly hunched over from the turbulence, and hastily adjusting his uniform jacket. Red dust had already settled on his leather shoes, and he looked as if he had been forcibly torn from an air-conditioned office full of papers and thrown into the arms of wild nature, which he obviously hated and despised.
Ivan Andreevich Belov.
Mayorov approached Voron, extending his hand. His hand was soft, with a perfect manicure. Ivan did not respond with a handshake, only nodded slightly, continuing to polish the blade of the knife with a piece of suede. He was wiry and strong, with a face lined with wrinkles like riverbeds on an old map. His short hair, thick with gray, was bleached by the sun, and his gaze, heavy, calm, and incredibly attentive, did not leave the knife. Mayorov felt as if he was looking not at him, but through him, seeing something invisible but important. "I'm Mayorov, Federal Security Service. We have been authorized to involve you in a case of special importance. Kidnapping." The lieutenant took several color photographs out of a folder. "This is the Tsarina's Tear, a painting that belonged personally to the last Russian Tsar. According to some sources, it is part of a collection that was kept in the Deep Canyon Artel." Voron did not take the photos.
Deep Canyon is the name of an artel that was abandoned about half a century ago, but, as he knew, Its underground bunkers and warehouses were used by some influential people to store valuables away from the prying eyes of the big land.
And why are you feds interested in a painting stolen from a private collection?
What business is it of mine? His voice betrayed a poorly concealed contempt for city laws, which had always been crooked and inconsistent. The painting is worth tens of millions of euros.
It was supposed to be exhibited at a European auction, where the world's leading museums were waiting for it. Mayorov swallowed, feeling uncomfortable under this intense, predatory gaze. But that's not all. They left this in place of the painting. He showed a photograph of an old, yellowed sketch, hastily attached to the wall. The drawing was careless, almost childish, but in the corner, there were several barely noticeable symbols and uneven lines. Our art experts consider it a mysterious message. Our forensic experts found nothing but general traces of human presence. We walked 2 kilometers from the artel along the perimeter, and the trail broke off, as if it had been washed away by water. This is the work of a professional. Or, Mayorov hesitated, or you know this area better than we do, and you can read what lies beyond the canvas. Voron finally looked up. He looked at the lieutenant, then at the helicopter, then at the horizon, where centuries-old fir trees traced a jagged line between the sky and the earth. Paintings, money, auctions. It was all urban, bustling dust. But the Deep Canyon Artel was located on a mountain fault line, in a place he considered sacred. If it was not just a painting that had been stolen, but some kind of information, as the sketch hinted, it could provoke an influx of gold diggers or artifact hunters. It was a violation of the balance. It was an invasion that threatened the very organism of the Taiga, and that fell under his jurisdiction, under his code of honor, which was stricter and more incorruptible than any criminal code. What does the crime look like, Mayorov? Asked Voron, finally sheathing his knife in its holster on his belt. Like an obsession. The owner of the collection is a well-known patron of the arts. He kept the painting a secret, knowing its true value, which may exceed its stated value. The criminal worked cleanly, but hastily. He left the bunker door closed, but the lock was torn out. It was important to him that the theft not be discovered immediately. So, he has a head start, and he doesn't want to be caught. He wants them to follow a false trail. Voron muttered, getting up. From his height of 6 feet, he looked down at Mayorov, and the lieutenant suddenly felt small and indecisive. I'm not your assistant, Lieutenant. I'm a tracking consultant. I don't leave the Taiga. I don't use your gadgets or your crime labs. We know. We need your method. You're the only one who can tell us what exactly was stolen and where the criminal went. Mayorov said, almost pleadingly. Voron slowly, as if considering a decision that would change the course of his entire life, put his well-used binoculars around his neck and strapped an axe to his backpack. The shadow jumped up, ready to follow its master. All right, Raven said hoarsely. Lead the way. But know this. If I don't like something, I'll turn around and leave, and no federal authority will make me come back. I make the rules in the Taiga. You city folks are just guests here. 5 minutes later, they were already on board the helicopter. The roar of the engines and the smell of fuel desecrated the peace of his forest even more loudly. Raven did not look at Mayorov or out the window. He closed his eyes, replaying the image of the deep canyon in his mind, and could already hear, not with his ears, but with his skin, the cry of disturbed equilibrium, coming from the place where the diagram had been removed. He had to follow this trail to restore order, and then to erase the trail and restore silence. It was the only honest path for him. And while they were flying, Raven had already begun to read the criminal, who must have been rushing to Europe now, but had left too many signs behind him in the Taiga, written with fear and greed. He knew that he was now flying to the scene of the crime, not to find the painting, but to read the Taiga's death cry. The hum of the helicopter, which had broken the silence of the Taiga, died away as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving behind only acrid smell of kerosene, which settled in a thin film on the moss. Raven got out of the machine without saying a word, and immediately sensed that something in this place was not as it should be. The Deep Canyon Collective consisted of several dilapidated barracks and a sealed entrance to a tunnel which, according to Mayorov, had been converted into a private bunker and storage facility in recent decades. The place was isolated, surrounded on three sides by almost sheer cliffs, as if specially created by nature for concealment. Mayorov, standing hesitantly next to two armed men in camouflage, looked anxiously at Ivan Andreevich. Voron paid no attention to them, the helicopter, or the formalities accepted in the big land. His gaze, heavy and attentive, immediately fixed on the ground. He began to examine the perimeter, but not quickly, but with the slowness characteristic of a bird of prey, looking for prey. His dog, Shadow, without moving from her spot, sat down on her hind legs and growled quietly. But it was not a warning of danger, but something else. The animal sensed disharmony, an alien presence that had already left, but left behind a smell. Raven was not looking for traditional clues, fingerprints, shell casings, scraps of clothing. He was reading the ground. For him, moss, grass, branches and stones were letters and sentences. At the very entrance to the bunker, which was a massive steel door, the mechanical lock had been torn out by the roots. The metal was deformed, but not cut. Strength and haste. That was the criminal's first thought. The lock was broken last night, between 7 and 9, said Voron, without looking up. He pointed the tip of his boot at a barely noticeable break in the lintel. The trace is fresh, but the metal has already been covered with a thin film of condensation, which usually appears here after sunset. The criminal worked at dusk. Mayorov tried to object. Our experts have determined that the theft was committed no more than 12 hours ago. Your experts determine the time of discovery, Lieutenant, Voron replied sharply, continuing to examine the ground. I determine the time of departure, and those are two different things. Take a look here. He pointed to a flat stone lying right by the door. At first glance, it seemed untouched, but Voron saw several grains of sand on it that were unusual for this place. It was fine quartz dust that the criminal had brought with him on the soles of his shoes when he walked along the road from the nearest village. He had prepared himself. He wasn't from around here, but he knew about the bunker. He didn't go there directly, but took a detour. But when he left, he was careless. Raven slowly walked around the entrance, focusing on the moss that grew like a thick carpet. His gaze stopped 2 meters from the door. Where the grass seemed flattened, Raven discovered what he called an unnatural order. Look here, Lieutenant. Here. He pointed to a barely visible, even depression. Something heavy was standing, maybe a box. The criminal took it away, but didn't just throw it away, but carefully moved it so as not to leave a drag mark. And here, He moved his finger to another area. The grass is almost completely straightened, but there is a mark left from heavy pressure. A knee. He crouched down, not to rest, but to check or record something.
The strangest thing was that Voron found no signs of a struggle. No debris, no blood, no torn moss that would indicate panic or resistance. It felt as if the bunker itself had opened its doors, allowing the painting to be taken.
The theft was planned with precision. This is not a random robber, and not a bandit who breaks in by force. This is a person who does not want to disturb the peace of the place, Voron whispered.
But he was very scared. Scared? Asked Mayorov, not understanding how one could see fear in trampled grass. Yes. Fear of the place, not of punishment.
He left no traces of a struggle, because he knew that if he made any noise, the Taiga would not forgive him. He acted quickly and carefully. He came in and left. Too clean, too perfect. He knew what to look for and where to find it. The painting wasn't hanging on the wall like in a museum. He took it out. They entered the storage room. The bunker was a dry, cool room with concrete walls and steel shelves. On one of the walls, where, according to the owner, the Queen's tear had hung, was now pinned that same old, yellowed sketch. The room had been examined earlier by European specialists who were looking for DNA, fingerprints, and microfibers. Voron ignored all that. He walked up to the wall, ignoring the crime scene tape, and looked at the place where the canvas had hung. The size is about 1 meter by 1.5 meters. The weight, with the stretcher and heavy frame, is at least 30 kilograms, Voron concluded. But the person who took it didn't have that kind of strength. He was light. And he didn't use a cart. But how? Mayorov no longer tried to argue. There was such unwavering confidence in Voron's words that even his skepticism melted away. He didn't take the whole painting. The painting was rolled up. Here. Voron pointed to a small, barely noticeable scratch on the wall, like a thread, which could only have been left by a sharp metal edge. There is a mark left by the removed frame. He took the painting down, rolled the canvas into a roll, and carried it under his arm. It weighed no more than 5 kilograms. He could move quickly. This shows his priorities. He wanted information, not material goods. Voron took the sketch from the wall, pinned with a paper clip. The drawing was done in charcoal and depicted something abstract, tree branches and a river. But its carelessness concealed a frightening accuracy. Holding it in his hands, Voron felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the temperature of the bunker. It was the coldness of greed. He turned the sketch over, looked at the back, then held it up to the light. Mayorov and his men fell silent, waiting for Raven to utter some kind of mystical prophecy. But Raven simply froze, his gaze becoming even heavier and more intense, as if he were talking to the paper. He discovered something that no forensic scientist had noticed. On the back, under a layer of yellowed paper, there were uneven, barely visible lines made with a hard, sharp object. Not paint, but perhaps a dry pen or a needle. "There is no mysterious message here, Lieutenant," Raven finally said, his voice as dull as stones in a mountain river. "And there is no art. It's a diagram, a map key disguised as a sketch. The criminal didn't leave it behind. He planted it, like an irrelevant burnt piece, to divert attention from what he really stole." Voron felt that the real crime
was just beginning.
It wasn't just a royal relic that had been stolen, but the opportunity to disrupt the balance of the Taiga, which was his only home. He clenched the paper in his hand. His work was just beginning, and now he had to learn to read tracks, not on the ground, but on paper. Not in the Taiga, but in Europe, where his alien trail had led.
He looked at the sketch with the same grim determination with which he had looked at the broken branch. It was an invitation to hunt.
The dull sound of Voron's footsteps on the concrete floor of the bunker was the only thing that broke the silence here.
Mayorov and his men, feeling out of place and useless, stepped aside, watching as Ivan Andreevich, like a priest of an ancient cult, concentrated on the thin, yellowed sheet of paper.
The sketch, planted by the criminal, was pinned to a massive table.
Under the light of the only dim bulb that Raven had demanded be brought in, his face seemed carved from stone, and his eyes burned with that heavy, attentive fire for which he was nicknamed Raven. He ignored the large charcoal strokes, the abstract image of branches and clouds, which could have been either Impressionism or a child's drawing. He was not an art expert. He was not interested in aesthetics, but in the background.
Your experts looked at it as if it were a canvas, Raven said quietly, his voice low and hoarse. They looked for symbols and styles that can be found in European auction catalogues. They looked for a price. But this is not a painting.
This is soil. He took a thin brush he had asked the forensic experts for and gently brushed microscopic particles off the surface of the sheet.
These were not specks of dust, but grains that had stuck to the paper while it was being worked on. Charcoal was used as a fixative. But it's not from an art store, he continued, bringing the tip of the brush to his eyes.
This is pure charcoal obtained by burning a certain resin. Such charcoal was previously used by miners to create a rough sketch of a diagram before transferring it to parchment. It produces a moisture-resistant line. And the smell. Raven sniffed. The smell of cedar. The resin burned quickly at a high temperature, but the cedar itself was not dry, but slightly damp from the core. Mayorov, standing behind him, whispered, "What does cedar have to do with it?"
We're talking about theft from the Tsar's collection. The painting, the Tsarina's tear, Lieutenant. Voron raised his finger without looking up from the paper. Its true value is not that it belonged to the Tsar, but what it concealed.
The royal family didn't just collect art. In 1917, they tried to save not only themselves, but also what they considered to be national treasures. Not gold, but information. He smoothed out the sketch on the table. In the light of the lamp, the lines he had mentioned earlier, made with a needle on the back, became visible. Now, knowing that it was a diagram, Voron saw not chaotic scratches, but topographical markings. The lines on the sketch that your people thought were scratches from improper storage. They're measurement points. Look. He traced one line with his fingernail. The angle of inclination matches the angle of the mountain range at this point. He pointed to the diagram of the bunker brought by Mayorov.
And if we superimpose this on the Artel's map, we see that these lines don't just coincide, they point to something underground.
The conclusion was not just logical, it was frighteningly simple and obvious. The Queen's tear was not a work of art,
but a coded map.
The canvas of the painting itself probably contained a chemical code that was revealed under certain lighting conditions, or when exposed to a reagent. It wasn't the painting that was stolen, but the information, Voron repeated, his eyes narrowing.
The criminal needed to obtain the complete, developed code from the canvas,
But to distract us from our goal, he left this sketch, which is a draft, or rather, a false clue. He wanted us to think that this was all that remained, and follow a false, artistic trail to Europe. Voron focused on the small details. There was a barely noticeable print on the corner of the sketch. Not a fingerprint, but a ring. The criminal wore a ring. Not a signet ring, but a narrow ring with an engraving. He pressed it into the paper when he attached the sketch to the wall. Raven took out a magnifying glass. The engraving is illegible, but I can see that it is handmade. Very delicate, antique. This suggests that the criminal is either involved in antiques himself or works for someone who is well connected in those circles. But that wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was what Raven found at the very bottom of the sketch, almost at the stationery pin. It was a tiny, barely noticeable particle. Not dirt, not dust, but something organic. He carefully picked it up with tweezers. "It's ash," Voron whispered, "but not cigarette ash." Mayorov waited nervously. "It's ash from burnt resin, from a tobacco leaf that was used to roll a cigarette. A variety that has not grown in our region for a long time, but is cultivated in southern Europe. This ash was left over from the last drag the criminal took, already with the rolled canvas under his arm. He was so confident in his speed and cleanliness that he allowed himself to smoke before the final sprint. He thought the Taiga couldn't see him. The conclusion was stunning. The criminal was a man with local knowledge. He knew about cedar charcoal and the bunker, but with European habits, rare southern tobacco, and connections. An antique ring. He was a hybrid man who used the primitive fear of the Taiga for his perfect crime. The criminal is already in Europe, Voron concluded, putting away his sketch. He spoke with such certainty, as if he himself had seen the man boarding the plane. He's not flying with the painting. He's flying to develop his scheme, using the reagents or equipment available in antique workshops. He will use the European auction network to legalize the stolen goods. Legalize what? If he just has a canvas, he won't be able to sell it as the Queen's Tear, Mayorov objected. He can, because the goal is not to sell the painting, but to legalize the artifact through demand for the work of art. He will sell the painting at a private auction, say that he found it in his attic, and change its provenance. But information about the sale, information about the painting, that will increase demand for what is hidden here. For what this diagram shows, gold or artifacts. Voron raised his eyes, and there was fury in his gaze, suppressed only by years of self-control. He wants to upset the balance of the Taiga by bringing treasure hunters here, using the Tsar and his painting as bait. And I won't let him do that. Ivan Andreevich handed Mayorov the sketch and a piece of ash. Here's your trail. Southern tobacco, a ring. Cedar charcoal, a man who knows how the earth breathes here. Consider this my report. Now I'm waiting for information from you about European auctions, where any artifacts related to the last emperor could have surfaced in the last 2 days. We will follow him through his own greed. The Raven turned around. He took a deep breath, trying to expel the foreign smell of kerosene and tobacco smoke from himself. He realized that his hunt would now take place across oceans and countries, following clues that he would have to read through the eyes of city detectives, whose methods
he so deeply despised. His weapon was not strength, but understanding.
An understanding of what had made a man who knew the laws of the Taiga betray it so. And that was far more intriguing and dangerous than any theft of a work of art. He left the bunker, and the shadow, sensing its master's tension, got up and followed him. The hunt was just beginning, and now it was not for a painting, but for a man who dared to break the eternal law of balance. The Raven did not return to the settlement. But he did not go deep into the Taiga either. He remained on the territory of the abandoned collective farm, near the bunker, setting up his minimalist camp. A small fire, a waterproof tent, and the shadow. Always on the alert. Mayorov and his men, having received a report about southern tobacco and cedar charcoal, were forced to admit that this man could see more than any forensic laboratory. The lieutenant hurried back to the mainland, leaving Voron the only means of communication he tolerated, a satellite phone with a massive antenna, which he used exclusively for short, urgent reports. Ivan Andreevich knew that the real work was just beginning. Now he had to reconstruct not only the fact of the theft, but also the psychology of the escape. He had to understand why a man who had worked so carefully inside the bunker had left so many clues on the trail of his escape. He walked 100 meters away from the artel and began to read the trail along which the criminal had disappeared into the night. The first thing that caught his eye was not dirt or a shoe print, but a barely noticeable, unnaturally broken branch of a dwarf cedar. It had been broken not by the wind, but by a sharp, strong blow. The blow had been delivered from below, which suggested that the criminal had stumbled while trying to avoid an obstacle while moving at high speed. Haste, fear, and a misjudgment of the terrain, Voron muttered, crouching down. A person born here knows where this dwarf pine is. He would have gone around it. So our thief is local, but he hasn't been here long. His eyes are still used to asphalt and smooth floors. He measured the distance from the broken branch to the next clue, a deep footprint on the damp ground. It wasn't a regular sneaker, but a hiking boot with a strong, almost military-style sole. But the tread was worn unevenly, more on the inside of the heel. An unusual gait, concluded Voron. The person carries a small but constant weight, probably a briefcase or a light bag that he always holds in one hand. This shifts the center of gravity, and he sniffed the damp ground where the footprint remained. It smells like gasoline here. Not kerosene, but high-octane gasoline. So he didn't leave on foot. He had transportation waiting for him. The Raven raised his head, looking toward the old, long-abandoned road leading to the pass. The road was overgrown, but a light SUV could still drive on it. He reconstructed the chronology. First, careful work in the bunker. Then, a hasty, nervous dash to the vehicle. The difference in mood was obvious. Inside the bunker, he was a cold-blooded thief. Outside, he was a hunted animal. He walked another 10 meters, focusing on the traces left by the fugitive himself. He found 2 more signs. A small but deep mark left on the bark of a tree that the criminal had leaned on to catch his breath, and the place where he had probably emptied the contents of his pocket. There lay fragments of plastic, microscopic particles from a disposable European lighter. The locals use matches or flint. The plastic is from the city. And Voron bent down to the ground. No traces of the canvas being dragged. The canvas was rolled up and light. Its entire weight is his fear. Putting all these words together into a single sentence, Voron pieced together a comprehensive picture of the criminal. A man, possibly middle-aged, familiar with the realities of the Taiga, but unaccustomed to them. He wears an engraved ring, smokes rare tobacco, constantly carries a load in one hand. The tread on his shoes is unevenly worn due to his shifted center of gravity. And most importantly, he was acting under intense pressure, on the verge of panic. Voron returned to his campfire. He typed a short message to Mayorov, knowing that the lieutenant would forward it to his European colleagues, whom Voron despised with his whole being, considering their methods ineffective and detached from reality. The criminal is male. Distinguishing feature: habit of carrying loads in his right hand. Walks with a tilt toward the inside of his heel. Not a local, but familiar with the area. Escape vehicle, SUV. Engraved ring. Tobacco, Southern. Conclusion: look for a man at European auctions who appears nervous but has direct access to antiques. He will avoid attention, but will not be able to hide his gait and habits, which he acquired here, in the Taiga. The answer came an hour later, breaking through the mountain rocks. It was not a report, but a request, which immediately caused Voron to feel a dull, restrained irritation. Dear Ivan Andreevich, our European colleagues are requesting additional data. We need to provide DNA analysis of the fibers found, as well as the exact make of the car based on tire microparticles. Is it possible to conduct DNA analysis of your dog's fur if it could have come into contact with a criminal? The Raven smirked. This request contained everything he hated about city logic. Useless scientific pedantry, an attempt to analyze the dead instead of reading the living, and complete helplessness in the face of simple human psychology. DNA analysis of Shadow Dog's fur. He looked at his dog, who was sleeping leaning against his boot, and shook his head. They're looking for clues, Raven whispered, and I'm looking for the reason that made him leave them. He ignored their request. Instead, he sent Mayorov a new, short message, which was to be the first step in a remote pursuit. My conclusion: the criminal rolled up the canvas. The painting is not framed. It is lightweight. The rolled-up canvas must be developed. Search in large European cities where there are legal restoration workshops that work with Russian paintings. Look for places where he can develop the scheme, not sell the painting. He got up and walked away from the camp. His method was to understand the criminal, driven by greed and fear. Voron knew that his motives were now mixed. The desire for easy money multiplied by nervousness. This man could not act logically and calmly in the city, because his psychology was shaped by fear of the Taiga. He went to the old pass, where, according to his calculations, the criminal had gone. There, on the clay soil, he found another fact that confirmed his guesses. A tire track from an SUV's tire. The tire was not new, with deep but worn treads, and judging by the weight and location of the tracks, there was another passenger in the car besides the driver. A second person, Voron whispered. But he wasn't in the bunker. He was waiting. He's the courier who will take him to the airport. He's his last link to the mainland. Now Voron had the whole picture. One was nervous, greedy, but knowledgeable about the Taiga. The other was cold-blooded, urban, ensuring the escape. And it was the second one, the courier, that he decided to bet on. The liaison had to leave his traces at the airport, at the hotel, at the auction house. Traces that city detectives would be able to read, even without his philosophy.
The hunt began, but it was conducted in his head. He sat in the Siberian wilderness, while his mind was already penetrating the back streets of London, the hotels of Paris, and the galleries of Vienna, searching not for fingerprints, but for traces of human greed. Raven spent almost a day at the pass, not to find new clues, but to completely preserve the ones he had already found, and to let his thoughts chase after the criminal. He sat on a hillock, watching the shadows slowly rotate, and in his soul, like in a deep lake, the whole logic of this crime was reflected. For him, the theft was not just an event, but a manifestation of a deep, systemic disease that had struck urban civilization. The disease of greed. He understood perfectly well that the person who stole the canvas map was not thinking about the millions of euros that could be obtained for the painting. He was thinking about the billions that the hidden information promised him. The painting was merely a medium, a key that opened the door to true wealth. But how could this wealth, obtained in the wilderness without documents or permits, be legalized? The answer lay in the painting itself. Legalization through origin, whispered Raven, addressing Shadow, who listened intently to his low, hoarse voice. The pattern encrypted in the canvas pointed to a gold deposit, or more likely, ancient artifacts hidden by royal engineers or geologists. If a criminal simply arrived in Europe with the map, no one would believe him. Or worse, he would be immediately arrested for illegal activity. But if he launched a story about the Tsar's tear into the European auction network, changing its origin from stolen to unexpectedly found in a private collection, he would create a chain reaction. The sale of the painting, even for a modest sum, will set a precedent. Here is proof that royal valuables can be found in the most unexpected places. This precedent, backed up by hype in the press, will instantly increase interest in any rumors related to royal treasures in Siberia. And this is where the stolen information came into play. The criminal had no intention of developing the vein himself or searching for artifacts. He was going to sell the information about the location to others, large corporations, private seekers, criminal syndicates. The painting, valued at millions, served only as a license to trust this information. And for the Taiga, this meant one thing: a violation of balance. Voron was not concerned with the criminal aspect of the theft. He did not care who would receive the money. He was concerned that his land, his territory, would be flooded with a wave of greedy, cynical people, ready to kill and destroy nature for profit. He remembered how 10 years ago, while still an inspector, he had encountered the consequences of illegal gold mining. Poisoned rivers, disfigured slopes, dead animals. It was not just a crime against the law, it was a crime against life. And that was Voron's true motive. He was not pursuing a thief, but a disease. He took out his satellite phone and dialed Mayorov, his voice harsh and devoid of emotion. Mayorov, listen carefully and pass this on to your lawnmowers in Europe. We're not looking for the painting itself. We're looking for the trigger. He'll try to sell or exhibit the painting in London or Paris within the next 48 hours. It won't be a major auction that attracts official attention, but a small, well-known gallery or private dealer. It will be quick. He doesn't need the highest price. He needs speed and provenance. Voron paused, sensing that Mayorov was trying to write something down. The motive,
legalization of information. The painting is an advertising brochure that he uses to sell the map.
Don't look for the thief, but for his contact, who will be in charge of selling the painting. The contact is cold-blooded, urban. He will leave traces in hotels and on public transport.
Ivan Andreevich, we've already issued an alert for your man with southern tobacco and a strange gait, Mayorov replied nervously. Our colleagues in London, I know what they're looking for. Voron cut him off.
And they're looking for the wrong person.
The man with southern tobacco is our thief. He went into hiding as soon as he arrived in Europe. He feels like a caged animal there. He'll avoid any contact. He's waiting. We need his courier.
Cold-blooded, clean, no traces of tobacco or cedar charcoal.
Raven closed his eyes, imagining this complex mechanism of crime. Greed always led to a loss of control. The man who stole the diagram was obsessed. Obsession is the weakest point.
Raven had to use that obsession against him.
He returned to the fire. Shadow nestled into his knees. Raven stroked her stiff fur, feeling the beating of the life he protected beneath his hand. Balance, Shadow, he whispered.
If one person takes too much, it destroys the lives of others. Our job is to restore order, not to find wealth. He knew that his philosophy was completely foreign to Mayorov, to European detectives, and even more so to criminals. For them, the law was a set of rules written on paper. For Voron, the law was the unbreakable code of the Taiga, where everyone had to take only as much as they could carry without harming the whole. A criminal who broke this law was a sick individual who had to be removed from the ecosystem so they wouldn't infect others. It wasn't retribution, but surgical intervention.
After receiving a new report from Voron, Mayorov, although completely baffled, forwarded it to its destination, and Voron, left alone with the Taiga, began his own remote analysis of the tracks.
He did not know their names, did not see their faces, but he sensed their intentions, their fear, and their greed. He knew that his work would not end with an arrest. It would only end when the traces of this crime were erased and the Taiga regained its silence. And now, in this silence, he waited for a response from Europe, knowing that sooner or later his city colleagues would stumble upon the courier's trail, because the thief's fear would cause the courier to act too quickly and too obviously. And when that happened, Raven would be ready. His eyes were fixed on the horizon. There, thousands of kilometers away, his invisible trail had already begun to lead to a truth that was far dirtier and more dangerous than the greatest theft in history. Ivan Andreevich Belov returned to his cabin. He couldn't sit idly by at the scene of the crime when the trail had disappeared over the horizon. His home, his silence. It was his base of operations, his laboratory, where he could read traces not on the ground, but in intentions. The satellite phone lay on a polished log next to a mug of hot Taiga tea. He waited. Waiting in the Taiga is not inaction. It is the highest form of attention. He listened to the sound of the wind in the pines, noted the movement of birds, watched the shadow. Any change in this balance could be the key. And the change came, but not from the forest, but via satellite communication, from a distant, alien world. The call from Mayorov was short and tense. The lieutenant spoke with barely contained excitement and confusion, which so annoyed Voron in city people. Ivan Andreevich,
We did it. Our European colleagues have arrested the first legalizer in London. We used your tip about antiques.
We didn't go to the big auction houses, but checked private galleries specializing in 20th century Russian painting. Who? Voron asked hoarsely. A certain Viktor Platov, the owner of a small but very exclusive salon.
He tried to plant information about the Tsarina's tear through his agent, claiming that the painting had surfaced in an old collection belonging to emigrants in South America. Our people caught him right in his office.
But the painting itself was not with him. Voron frowned. It worked, but he expected it to work. He wasn't proud of his success. He just saw that greed was a universal law that applied both in the Taiga and in European capitals. Platov is a courier, not a thief, Voron cut in. His habits? Mayorov had apparently already studied the file.
40 years old, clean, works with art objects, has been flying a lot lately.
He has a strange habit. He always carries a small, old-fashioned cigarette case with him, silver, engraved. He always holds it in his left hand, and he has a very steady gait. He never stumbles. Voron felt the tension leave his shoulders. Smooth gait, silver cigarette case. This was the very urban clue he was looking for. The man waiting in the car at the pass was cool-headed and neat. He was the liaison. He was the first hook on which they had to catch the whole network.
He doesn't have the painting, and he won't say where it is. Voron predicted. He's expendable.
Our thief, the man with the southern tobacco, has already gone into hiding and is waiting for Platov to make the first breach in the official investigation.
Now that Platov has been arrested, our thief will realize that the legalization channel is closed. He will become nervous.
But Platov was with an agent, interrupted Mayorov. The agent managed to escape. He had documents that point to a large auction house in Paris. That's our next step. We are already coordinating with the French police. The agent, Voron repeated slowly. Another expendable. The French police will follow the agent's trail, but that's a mistake. Our thief is no fool. He knew Platov could be caught. He prepared a backup route for the painting in advance to create false panic and distract attention. Voron took a stick and began to draw a diagram on the ground covered with pine needles. On one side was the bunker, on the other was London, and now Paris. The thief's goal was time. He needed to buy time to reveal his canvas diagram in a secluded place and start selling information while everyone was chasing after the painting. The criminal will abandon both Platov and the agent. He is already preparing for the next step. The painting is a decoy. London and Paris adjust a diversionary tactic to make the European police work according to false, traditional rules. His voice became harsh, with notes of undisguised contempt for someone else's method. You're looking for the painting, and I'm looking for the place where he's developing it. Voron dictated a new summary to Mayorov, based solely on the logic of fear and greed. Platov is the first drop. The agent is the second drop. The painting is not in Paris. Paris is a false trail that will lead you away from your true goal. The painting is where it can be revealed, and where there is little control.
Look for old restoration workshops or private storage facilities that work with chemical reagents and old canvas.
Look in small towns with a history of Russian presence or a rich antique tradition. It could be Vienna, Prague, or one of the cities on the Rhine. You won't take any risks in Paris,
where there are too many cameras and too much attention. Mayorov listened with obvious distrust.
But, Ivan Andreevich, Platov has been arrested, and the agent is on his way to Paris. We must follow him. Follow him, Lieutenant. And catch your breath. Voron cut him off. I'm giving you an accurate prediction.
If you go to Paris, you'll lose another 48 hours, and our thief will have time to start the process of legalizing the information. You must act asymmetrically. You must look not for what is shown, but for what is hidden. He turned off the communication device. He knew that his instructions would most likely be ignored. City logic always chooses the most direct, most obvious path. And they would go to Paris. He returned to the fire.
Shadow caught his gaze and whimpered quietly. They're looking for a man with a cigarette case, Shadow. A man with an even gait. They don't understand that this man is just bait. And where there is bait, there is always a predator lurking nearby.
And that predator is now hiding somewhere in a quiet European city, trembling with fear and anticipation.
The Raven picked up his old binoculars and stared for a long time at the horizon, which seemed to separate his world from the world of greed and vanity. He had to impose his game on them,
And he knew that, thanks to his accurate prediction of the arrest, they would no longer be able to completely ignore his next instructions, even if they seemed crazy to them. His remote pursuit began by making his city assistants doubt their own logic, and that was just the beginning. He knew that his main enemy was not the thief, but his own pride and obsession with wealth, and that was exactly what the Raven was going to play on. 2 days after Platov's arrest in London, the Raven received the expected message. The European lawnmowers, as he mentally called all city detectives, ignored his warning about the false trail and rushed to Paris. The agent Mayorov had mentioned was found, but too late. He calmly left the city, leaving behind only a hotel paid for several days in advance and the key to a safe deposit box, which of course turned out to be empty. The Paris trail turned out to be a cold dead end, which only confirmed Voron's thesis that they were chasing a ghost. Voron sat on the porch of his cabin. Above his head hung the high, imperturbable Siberian sky. He held a satellite phone in his hands, which seemed like a foreign object in this world of wood and stone. Mayorov finally called, not to report back, but to ask for advice. His voice betrayed humility, mixed with the remnants of professional pride.
Ivan Andreevich, your prediction was correct.
Nothing. The agent is clean. No pictures. We need a new location. You said Vienna or Prague? Why those two? Because it's quiet there, replied Raven, his voice low and steady. And there are old Russian connections there that aren't as noticeable as in London or Paris. Our thief isn't just looking for a buyer. He's looking for someone to develop the scheme. He needs an anonymous place where he can work quietly with canvas and chemicals. You won't go to a large laboratory. You'll go to an old, inconspicuous master who isn't being sought after.
Voron closed his eyes, transporting himself from the Siberian wilderness to the center of Europe. Now he was reading not the land, but a man he could only see through indirect signs. Southern tobacco, an uneven gait, fear mixed with greed.
He reconstructed his psychology. Our thief is a man of the Taiga, but he is obsessed with wealth. In Europe, he is like a beast trapped in a steel cage. He feels vulnerable, and this causes him to make mistakes that are not visible to your cameras, but are visible to me. He is nervous. He does not sleep. He is constantly looking around, and he always keeps his cargo with him, even if it is just a rolled-up canvas. Voron asked Mayorov to pass on to his European colleagues a series of requests that were as illogical as possible from their point of view, based on his analysis of the criminal sphere. Have them check all the small hotels in Vienna and Prague that are located near antique districts. Look for someone who registered under a fake name, but often ordered tea, not coffee, but tea. Tea? Why tea? Mayorov's voice sounded completely perplexed.
Because a greedy and nervous person in the cold is a person who is constantly shivering.
Hot tea is a way to warm your hands and calm your nerves. That doesn't attract attention like alcohol, Voron explained patiently, as if explaining to a child. Next, have them look for traces of the particular brand of cigarettes he smokes. That's Southern tobacco. He won't be able to give it up. He'll smoke it in his room or on the balcony, and the ash will always leave a trace that your cleaners will ignore, but which may be in the trash cans. But the main clue that Raven could only consider remotely was related to his gait. Ask them to use the street camera recordings, but look for movement, not his face. A gait with a tilt to the inside of the heel. A shifted center of gravity. He always instinctively holds his right arm, as if he is carrying something heavy, even if it is a psychological burden, Raven dictated. It's a habit that can't be erased. He can change his clothes, change his hairstyle, but he can't change his biological reaction to the burden he carried through the taiga. That burden is his greed. For the first time in his life, Mayorov seemed to be trying to comprehend a detective method based on physiology and fear, rather than digital data. He promised to pass on all the information. Voron turned off his phone. He knew that his method was pure survival psychology projected onto crime. A person who has spent several days in the taiga under pressure bears the mark of that experience. His body remembers the heaviness, the cold, and the need for constant tension. And the city is a trap. The city is too soft. It relaxes you, and those instinctive taiga habits come to the surface. He imagined his opponent sitting in a cheap European hotel. A thief who stole not a painting, but the hope of untold wealth. This man lived in constant psychological tension. Every phone call, every knock on the door was a blow to the heart. His eyes, accustomed to watching for beasts in the forest, now watched for enemies in the crowd. His brain, accustomed to the simplicity of the taiga's laws, now struggled with the complexity of European bureaucracy and legalization. This obsession with gold made him weak. The fear of losing what he had stolen forced him to rush with his plan, and rushing always meant a broken branch in the taiga. And Raven, sitting on the other side of the world, read this broken branch. His analysis led him to believe that Vienna was more likely than Prague. Vienna was a city of the old aristocracy, of old, half-forgotten ties to the Russian Empire. There was a better chance of finding a quiet, discreet restorer there, who, for a large sum of money, and turning a blind eye to the origin, would be able to reveal the Tsar's canvas scheme. Prague had too many tourists, too much random movement. Vienna was quiet and old. This was what a man who had come from a forgotten place, from the deep canyon, was looking for. Voron took his binoculars and looked at the forest for a long time. The taiga did not judge. It simply was, and the man who disturbed its peace would have to face the consequences, regardless of where he was, here or thousands of kilometers away. His task was to point him out, just as a hunter points out a trail. Catching him was the job of the lawnmowers. But he knew that his tracking from a distance was the most dangerous part of this hunt. He imagined it again. A tired man sitting in a small room, nervously drinking hot tea, rolling a cigarette with his trembling fingers from his favorite rare tobacco, and next to him lay a rolled-up canvas, promising him everything he could wish for. This man was driven, and soon his greed would cause him to make a fatal mistake. And Raven waited patiently for that mistake. His own obsession was different. He was obsessed with truth and order. Suddenly, there was a quiet, almost indistinguishable sound. The shadow raised its head. The raven listened. It was not the wind. It was a faint, distant noise, like the rustling of paper. He realized that somewhere out there in Europe, his invisible opponent, succumbing to fear, had finally unfolded the canvas. The process of revealing the pattern had begun. And that meant that time was running out. For them, the hunt had entered a new, more dangerous phase. The unexpected success in London and the expected failure in Paris forced European detectives to follow Voron's instructions, although their methods remained ridiculously slow and excessive to Ivan Andreevich. He spent the next day in the silence of his cabin, studying old yellowed archival documents that Mayorov had sent him via satellite communication, with great difficulty and even greater distrust. These were records of geological expeditions from the early 20th century, and inventories of property that the last Russian Tsar had tried to take out of the country. Voron wasn't looking for coincidences. He was looking for intent. He knew that the painting stolen by his man of the Taiga wasn't created for aesthetic pleasure. It was created to be hidden. In the 17th year, they hid not only money, but also knowledge, Voron muttered, running his finger over the text on the screen. Knowledge that is more valuable than gold. In one of the inventories, he found a mention of a small painting called The Queen's Tear, which was listed as a personal creation with no artistic value. But next to it, in a note, was a barely noticeable mark. The frame contains an alloy that reacts to a reagent. The canvas is the key. This was confirmation. The value of the painting was not in the paints or the brush, but in its chemistry. Voron immediately contacted Mayorov, demanding that all forces in Europe be transferred from Paris to Vienna. Vienna, Voron dictated, as if carving the words out of stone. Not in the tourist center. Look for an old, family-owned antique shop or restoration workshop in a quiet neighborhood. Our thief won't go to a public place. He needs a craftsman who remembers the old traditions of working with royal artifacts. Someone who can reveal the hidden pattern using those very same reagents that are now banned or forgotten. Mayorov, who was under pressure because of the failure in Paris, no longer argued. He only asked questions for clarification, trying to translate Voron's Taiga logic into city language. But Ivan Andreevich, why Vienna? And why an antique shop, not a large auction house? An auction house looks for price, Voron replied. Our thief doesn't need a high price for the painting. He needs legitimacy and speed. If he sells the painting through a major auction, it will attract the attention of the FSB
Interpol, and the owner of the collection. That will take weeks, and he needs it tomorrow. Voron explained his theory about the double bottom of the auction. The painting will be sold privately through a small antique shop in Vienna. He's using it as a leak.
Vienna is perfect. A crossroads city, a city of old secrets. The painting will sell quickly, perhaps for half its face value. But it is the origin and speed of this sale that will act as a trigger. The news that the Queen's tear has suddenly surfaced in Vienna will instantly cause a stir among collectors and corporations. He emphasized his main idea, his philosophy, once again. The goal is not the money for the canvas, but the price of information on the scheme. The criminal is not selling the painting, but access to a deposit or artifact, using the painting as proof of the legitimacy of his words. Voron remembered an old archive he had seen several years ago when he was working at a reserve associated with the study of former Tsarist lands. It mentioned a Russian restorer who had left for Austria after the revolution. Look for a workshop that deals with early 20th century Russian painting. Try to find connections with the surname Sokolov. 50 years ago, there was a well-known but not public restorer with that surname in Vienna. Our thief, or his curator, must have known about him. Mayorov, shocked by this sudden historical accuracy, promised to pass on the request. Voron knew that his knowledge of Tsarist artifacts, gained through years of working with archives, was now his most powerful weapon. He was not just a tracker. He was a crime archaeologist, searching for the roots of evil in the past. The connection was lost. Voron was left alone. He felt the thread he had stretched across thousands of kilometers tighten to its limit. He had given them the exact address. Now, everything depended on the speed of the city folks. But he felt that his man from the Taiga, his opponent with the uneven gait, was not sitting still. He was cornered. His plan to legalize through Platov had failed. His greed mixed with fear would not allow him to wait. He was already in Vienna, somewhere in a quiet workshop, looking at the developed plan. His plan was supposed to be two-stage. First Platov, then the second, more direct route. Suddenly, Voron felt that he had missed something. He remembered the southern tobacco, the nervous rush on the escape route. A man who is so afraid would not entrust the canvas to a courier after Platov's failure. He had to deliver it to Vienna himself to develop the blueprint. That explained his nervousness. If he brought the canvas himself, then he must be somewhere nearby, not far from the place where it was revealed. And he couldn't help but leave a trace. Voron picked up the phone again. He needed to clarify details that no one but him would consider important. Mayorov. Voron's voice was even more tense. I want your people in Vienna to look for more than just Sokolov's studio. They should search for a hotel within a kilometer of the studio and look for a man who recently checked out, yesterday or this morning. A limp and a ring. A ring. The very same hand-engraved ring that left a mark on the sketch in the bunker. In his haste to leave Vienna after the diagram was developed, he could have forgotten something small but important. His personal mark, which he had tried so hard to hide in the Taiga. Why did you check out? Asked Mayorov, his voice trembling with fatigue and tension. Because he got what he wanted. Information. The canvas is now just paper. He'll throw it away or destroy it. He's gone. And he went where the diagram leads. Back to the Taiga to stake his claim. Before the news of the painting sale in Vienna spreads around the world. Time is running out, Lieutenant. We may only have a few hours before the world learns about the Tsar's gold.
Voron turned off his phone, feeling the cold metal. The hunt had moved into the direct pursuit phase. He knew his opponent was now flying back to Deep Canyon. And now, they were about to clash.
And that clash would take place on his territory. A territory where the law belonged not to people, but to balance. The Raven's warnings, sent from the Siberian wilderness, reached Vienna late, but worked with frightening accuracy.
European police, following instructions about the quiet workshop and the name Sokolov, discovered an old, half-closed restoration studio in one of the side streets. The master, an old Austrian with Russian roots, confirmed that 2 days earlier, a taciturn man had approached him with a request to urgently develop and fix an old, twisted canvas. Payment was made in cash, without any documents. The master, himself obsessed with the secrets of the old empire, developed the chemical code and made a high-precision copy. The painting itself was no longer in the workshop. At that moment, when European detectives were celebrating their first real success, Voron sat by the fire and felt the thread, connecting him to the criminal, stretch to its limit, and then snap. He knew his opponent was gone.
And it was not a mistake. It was the price of the mistake of urban logic. Mayorov called, his voice full of nervous excitement. We were a few hours too late, Ivan Andreevich. We found the hotel where the man with the fake passport had checked in.
He checked out this morning and paid his bill in advance. His gate. They checked the camera recordings. His center of gravity was shifted. He's your thief.
We almost caught him. Almost caught him means he won, Lieutenant. Voron cut him off sharply. What did you find in the workshop? A copy of the diagram. It's very clear. And the canvas itself was pinned to the wall of the workshop. Abandoned.
He left it behind. But Mayorov's voice became uncertain. But our experts say the diagram is incomplete. It's a map, yes, but not of the entire deposit. It leads to a specific place, but there's nothing there.
Empty rock. Voron felt his guesses take shape. He stood up, his gaze cold and penetrating. He didn't leave an incomplete diagram, Mayorov. He left a false one. He explained. The thief, driven by greed, realized he was being pursued.
Platov's arrest, the sudden interest in Vienna, all this was evidence that he had been found out. In a panic, he realized he had two options. Either try to sell the whole diagram and take a risk, or use part of it to create a diversion. He used canvas chemistry to reveal a double code. The primary code led to the true destination, artifacts or a rich vein. The secondary code led to a false, poor deposit, which he had marked on the canvas in advance.
He knew that the European police, upon receiving the diagram, would immediately pass it on to geologists. The geologists would arrive, find nothing, and declare the painting useless. But why? Mayorov wondered.
If they find the false location, they'll realize it's a hoax.
They'll realize it's a hoax, Lieutenant, but they'll waste time, said Voron, his voice imbued with cold confidence.
He wants us to chase after the false gold while he calmly gets to the real thing. He left the false part of the diagram, which confirms that he stole the information. But this information is irrelevant.
He is demonstrating cunning, but the cunning of a cornered animal. Most importantly,
European detectives, following their conventional logic, immediately rushed to check this false lead.
They focused on geological analysis, while the criminal, who had obtained the real key, was already on a plane.
"Did you check the ring?" asked Voron, moving on to his main, personal clue. "The ring?" Mayorov hesitated. "Yes."
A small wedding ring was found in the room, under the bed. It's simple, but it has a hand-engraved inscription. AV 95.
Our forensic expert believes that it may not belong to the thief, but was planted there on purpose. Voron ignored the forensic expert's doubts. The ring.
AV 95. It was a personal mark,
Not the one he saw in the sketch, but something connected to his life that he left behind in his haste. A greedy person always leaves something personal behind.
"He didn't plant the ring, Lieutenant." Raven looked at Shadow, who was sitting next to him, listening intently. "He lost it in a panic. Planting something is pure calculation. Losing something is emotion."
This is our thief, driven by greed.
Raven felt that his opponent hadn't just run away. He had made a show of it. He showed that he was one step ahead. And this act of pride mixed with fear was his biggest mistake.
We are looking for a man whose name begins with A or B. Raven focused. And he's in a hurry. He flew east. He won't go through Moscow. He'll fly to the Far East, and from there to us, to the pass. He has to stake his claim while you're digging through empty rock.
And he won't go searching. He'll go straight to his goal. Voron requested flight logs from Vienna and Prague from Mayorov, indicating eastern destinations.
He knew that his job now was a race against time. A race against a man who had betrayed his code and was now intoxicated by greed, running to destroy his world. He stood on the threshold of his hut, breathing in the clean, frosty air of the taiga.
The plan he had been sketching in his mind was now clear. The thief, Arthur or Valerie, with southern tobacco, a ring, an uneven gait, and fear in his eyes, was already flying east. And he was flying straight into Voron's hands.
Ivan Andreevich felt a strange, gloomy satisfaction. Finally, his opponent had returned to his territory, where his city tricks and double codes would be meaningless. Here, in the taiga, he would be judged not by the law written by men, but by the law written by moss and stone. He prepared his backpack, checked his knife, and gave Tenny the command, "Follow." He needed to return to the pass.
But before he took his first step, his gaze involuntarily fell on the Artel's map, which he was holding in his hands. The false diagram, planted by the criminal, overlapped with the real one, and Voron saw something ominous in this coincidence. The false deposit was located where, many years ago, Raven, as an inspector, had prevented a major act of poaching involving the illegal felling of cedar trees. This place had personal, almost symbolic significance for him.
Suddenly, it dawned on him. The stolen map was not just a map of wealth. It was a map of revenge. The criminal knew about his past, about his attachment to these places. He didn't just want gold. He wanted to ruin his taiga, a place that Voron considered sacred. Voron felt a rush of cold fury. He had underestimated the personal motive.
He thought the criminal was driven only by greed. But he was also driven by hatred. And that changed everything.
It meant that his opponent was not a random thief. It was someone who knew him, Voron, personally. Someone from his past.
He clenched the ring that Mayorov had sent him in the form of a photograph. AV 95. It wasn't just a date. It was a starting point. And his heart, hardened by years of living in the wild, felt the familiar cold call of the hunt.
The hunt for the man who dared to disturb not only the balance of the Taiga, but also his personal peace. He turned to Shadow. "Let's go, old friend. The game is over. It's time to go home." The real hunt begins here. A cold, inky night descended on the Taiga, compressed by silence and the smell of smoke from cedar logs. Raven sat by the fire, throwing a couple more dry branches into it.
Shadow, resting her head on his knees, sighed quietly in her sleep.
The Raven's world was extremely simple and understandable. But somewhere far away, in the capitals of Europe, he had left a mark that now, like a cancerous tumor, sought to return and destroy this peace. He had lost. Not by much, but he had lost.
His opponent, the man with southern tobacco and nervous hands, had escaped capture in Vienna, and, having obtained the diagram, was now flying back. The Raven predicted his every move, based on the logic of greed. London was the bait. Paris was the false trail. Vienna was the place of manifestation, and the final dash back to stake his claim. But somewhere in this flawless logic, there was a wormhole that gave him no peace. He took the photo sent by Mayorov out of his pocket, a wedding ring found in a Vienna hotel room. Simple gold, but hand-engraved. AV 95. He twirled the photo between his fingers, trying to read not the engraving, but the soul of the person who left it. "Greed, Shadow," Raven whispered, his voice as dull as a stone in water. "Greed makes people leave traces, but this man left more than just a trace. He left a personal symbol. Criminologists would call it a mistake made in haste. Raven saw something else in it. A man who had prepared so carefully for his escape could not have simply forgotten the ring. He would have thrown it away. But he left it under the bed, as if he didn't want it to be found, but couldn't bring himself to destroy it. It was an act of denial, or farewell. Ivan Andreevich returned to the moment of escape from the Artel. He imagined again how this man rolling up the canvas ran in panic to the car. He stumbled over a cedar stalanic, nervously taking a drag of rare tobacco. Fear and greed. But what made him choose this particular stalanic, this particular route? He remembered the map. It was an exact overlay of the false diagram that the criminal had planted on the city folks onto the real map of the area. The false deposit indicated on the diagram was located exactly where, 10 years ago, Voron, then Inspector Belov, had detained a group of poachers who were trying to illegally cut down an ancient cedar forest. That poaching was a cover for illegal gold mining. The case cost Voron his career, as he crossed paths with an influential official. But it saved that section of the forest. Suddenly, everything fell into place in Voron's mind, like pieces of a puzzle that he had assembled not with his hands, but with his soul. It's not about gold, Shadow. His eyes narrowed, his heavy gaze fixed on the dark canopy. It's about me. He realized that his mistake was underestimating personal motive. He had pursued a logic driven by greed, when the real driving force was hatred, disguised as greed. The painting, the scheme, the legalization. It was all just a means to revenge. The criminal, AV,
didn't just want to get rich. He wanted to take revenge on Voron by ruining his territory.
He wanted to bring hundreds of greedy people here who would dig up and destroy the Taiga area that was sacred to Ivan Andreevich. To disrupt the balance so that Voron, even if he stopped them, would never be able to restore the peace again.
If this is revenge, then AV is someone from his past. Someone he may have arrested or crossed paths with. Someone who knows his philosophy and his vulnerabilities.
The Raven took out his old, worn notebook with notes on all the cases he had worked on as an inspector. He flipped through the pages, looking for the combination of AV and 95. 95 could be a date, an article number, or, most personally, a year. The year of loss or change.
His gaze stopped on a case from 10 years ago, the very poaching on the cedar forest that he remembered. The case involved Andrei Vlasov, an engineer who had developed the scheme for illegal gold mining under the guise of logging.
Vlasov was arrested, but released a few years later under an amnesty. The case file contained a note about his personal belongings. An engagement ring with an engraved inscription was confiscated. The year was 2005.
Not 1995, but the error in the code could have been intentional. Voron felt his heart sink. Andrei Vlasov. He remembered him, a cunning, intelligent man who behaved like a barbarian in the Taiga, but like an aristocrat in the city.
He was the one who could have had the necessary connections in Europe to pull off such a complex legalization scheme. And he was the one who could have known about the bunker in Deep Canyon, where he had previously worked as an engineer.
Ivan Andreevich remembered how Vlasov had looked at him during his arrest, not with fear, but with cold, hidden hatred. Now the whole picture became clear. The ring, the Southern tobacco, the familiar route, the fake scheme in his place.
Vlasov didn't just want wealth. He wanted Voron to know who did it and why. He wanted to ruin his world, to take revenge for his broken life. The turning point had come. Voron was no longer a consultant on the logic of crime. He had become a personally involved hunter. He picked up the satellite phone. He dialed Mayorov, his voice harsh, but with a new, deep steeliness. Forget about the fake deposit, Lieutenant, and forget about the paintings and auctions.
The criminal is Andrei Vlasov, an engineer, 48 years old. He was associated with the Deep Canyon cartel and was released under an amnesty 10 years ago. He's flying to us.
Look for him on all flights going to the Far East, with a further transfer to light transport in our region. Vlasov. But how do you know? Mayorov was stunned. Because he left me a personal message, Lieutenant. His ring. And I know how to read personal messages. You'll find his trail in the Taiga. He'll go straight ahead. He's not afraid anymore. He's obsessed. Voron turned off his phone, placed it next to the fire, and began to quickly pack his backpack. Now he didn't need to wait. He needed to go. The pursuit of logic was over. The pursuit of the man who dared to encroach on his equilibrium had begun. His legs, his eyes, his dog, these were his true tools. Vlasov had the plan. But Raven had the most important thing. Motive. And that was a weapon that never failed. He and Shadow quickly disappeared into the night shadows of the Taiga, heading for the pass. The hunter knew that his opponent was only a few hours' flight away, and they were about to meet, which would put an end to their long, unfinished history. The cool morning sun was barely breaking through the thick fir trees when Raven and Shadow approached the pass. The night had passed in a quick, almost silent transition.
Ivan Andreyevich no longer relied on satellite reports, which were slow and filled with city noise. Now he relied only on his feet, his experience, and his cold, precise knowledge of his enemy. Andrei Vlasov, an engineer, a former employee whom Raven knew and remembered. This name, associated with the ring and the false diagram, became not just an identifier, but a point of no return. All his previous logic, based on pure abstract greed, fell apart.
The crime was personal. It was a card of revenge. Voron stopped at an old, abandoned railroad track that once led to the collective farm. Here, on solid ground, Vlasov's tracks should have been minimal. But Voron was not looking for physical traces, but for the imprint of intent. He crouched down, studying not the moss, but the air.
Vlasov, knowing he was being pursued and obsessed with revenge, would not have taken the obvious route. He had to choose the fastest, but also the most provocative path. Baron took a photo of the ring out of his pocket. AV 95. He recalled the case from 10 years ago. Vlasov was married. His wife Anna filed for divorce as soon as he was imprisoned. The year of their marriage was 1995. The ring found in Vienna was a wedding ring.
Vlasov had left behind not just a personal item, but a symbol of his broken life. The blame for which he obviously placed on Voron, who had arrested him and destroyed his business scheme. He doesn't just want gold, Voron whispered. He wants me to see my house collapse, just like his house collapsed. Voron raised his head and looked at the bend in the mountain where the true scheme, revealed in Vienna, led. It was a place of ancient, untouched forests, a protected area that bordered the former Artel. If Vlasov staked a claim there, he would sell the information to corporations that would come here with equipment and people, completely indifferent to the environment. They would disfigure this mountain range, and no law could stop them if they started mining. The balance would be disrupted forever. Ivan Andreyevich understood. His opponent, having received the map, did not analyze it. He believed in it. As an engineer, he knew that the Tsarist geological surveys were reliable. Vlasov, driven to the limit by greed and hatred, acted on emotion. And that made him predictable. He would not go around in circles. He would go straight ahead, directly to the point indicated on the map, in order to be the first to arrive. Voron picked up the satellite phone again and dialed Mayorov. He should have been on a flight to the east. Did you find him? Yes, Ivan Andreyevich. We're looking. Vlasov flew out of Vienna with a stopover in Istanbul. Next stop, Vladivostok. He should arrive within the next 20 hours. We're preparing a capture team. But he'll most likely fly from there to our region on a private plane. He won't fly on a private plane, Voron said confidently. That's too public. He'll use a helicopter. Or, even more cunningly, he'll buy an all-terrain vehicle in one of the villages and go through abandoned logging roads. He's a man of the Taiga. He doesn't trust the open sky. He trusts the earth. He'll stay as close to the ground as possible until he reaches his destination. Raven gave precise instructions on where Mayorov should direct his main forces to block all possible ground routes for Vlasov. Not in the center, but in the wilderness. Using old posts and cordons, he knew they would be useless, but it would create the illusion of control and make Vlasov even more nervous. I'm going to the target. Raven looked at Shadow. You must be ready to meet him when I bring him. But don't interfere. I have to do this alone. But, Ivan Andreyevich, this is a federal crime, Mayorov tried to object.
No, Lieutenant. This is personal. And it's a crime against the Taiga.
And that's my jurisdiction. Voron turned off the connection before Mayorov could object. He left the satellite phone under a small rock. He didn't need it now. He no longer needed the eyes of others. His eyes and Shadow's eyes were all he needed. He began to move. Now it was pure hunting. Vlasov flew, intoxicated by the proximity of wealth, clutching the map in his hand. Voron walked, relying on his knowledge of his opponent's fear and hatred. He knew that Vlasov had gone straight ahead, taking the shortest route indicated on the map, ignoring all obstacles. But the Taiga does not forgive ignorance. The straight path is always the most dangerous.
On one section of the trail, where dense young growth was growing, Voron found what he was looking for. A new, fresh trail. Not from an all-terrain vehicle, but from a person.
The very same uneven footprint with a tilt toward the inner part of the heel. Vlasov. He was already here. He was several hours ahead of them. Voron crouched down.
Next to the footprint, he noticed that the moss was not just flattened, but seemed to be burned in one spot. Voron sniffed. The smell of sulfur. Vlasov had used something to mark his path, perhaps hunting matches or some kind of chemical marker. This was another sign of his nervousness. He was afraid of getting lost in familiar territory. Fear was erasing his memory of the laws of the Taiga. He's in a hurry. He's not looking at his feet. He's only looking at the map, whispered Raven. He realized that Vlasov, obsessed with revenge, would make a major mistake. He would try to destroy the place he himself had decided to plunder in order to inflict maximum damage on Raven. He wouldn't just find the vein. He would try to blow up the entrance or stake out the territory with particular cruelty. Now Raven walked quickly but silently. The shadow walked ahead, her ears alert. They became one, a machine searching for the disturbed balance. The Raven knew that his personal battle for the Taiga would soon be over. And in this final act, there would be no place for laws written on paper. There would only be the law of nature. They rounded the last mountain spur. Below, in a narrow, sheltered gorge, where, according to calculations, the true plan led. The Raven saw what he had been looking for so long. A low, almost invisible hole in the rock, covered with vegetation, probably an ancient, camouflaged entrance to a mine or cave. And next to it, Vlasov. Andrei Vlasov was kneeling, clutching the crumpled diagram in one hand and a small but powerful detonator in the other. He was wearing torn and dirty city clothes, and his face, covered with thick stubble, was contorted into a feverish, insane smile. Tools and the remains of that very southern tobacco cigarette lay scattered around him. Vlasov looked exhausted, but his eyes burned with the same fire that Voron had seen in the eyes of the most greedy and lost people. A fire that destroys everything it touches. A turning point, Raven said quietly, his voice hoarse and low, instantly piercing the silence of the gorge. Vlasov flinched and turned sharply. His mad smile instantly disappeared, replaced by an expression of pure animal terror. He saw Raven standing on a rock, as if carved out of the cliff, and next to him, Shadow, growling quietly, ready to pounce. At that moment, Andrei Vlasov realized that he was not just at a gold mine. He was on Raven's territory, and the hunt that had begun in London and Vienna would end here, in the Taiga, according to its harsh and immutable laws. The hunt had begun. The raven and the shadow moved across the mountain slopes with a determined silence that was impossible for a person living a city life. Their path lay toward the gorge marked on the map, the place where Andrei Vlasov, possessed by revenge and greed, planned to stake his claim. Raven knew that Vlasov would rush, that he would act at the limit, and that rushing in the Taiga was always a fatal mistake. While Voron was moving across the land, his predictions were confirmed in the Far East. Mayorov finally acted quickly, guided by names and facts. Andrei Vlasov was recorded as arriving at the port of Vladivostok on a fake passport. He did not take a private plane. He bought an old but powerful all-terrain vehicle in a coastal village and rushed westward along abandoned logging roads, trying to get to the mountainous area as quickly as possible. The information about his movements, constantly coming from Mayorov, was only background noise for Voron. He was not interested in the kilometers traveled by the car, but in the traces left by Vlasov himself on the last pedestrian section of the route. Voron came out to the abandoned railroad, where he had earlier found traces of the car. Now it was quiet there. Only the wind rustled in the dry wires. But Voron focused on the narrow, barely noticeable path leading to the pass. The shadow walking ahead pricked up its ears. "Can you smell it, old man?" Voron whispered. "The smell of someone else's fear." He discovered the first fresh footprint, a deep, sharp imprint of a boot, confirming his analysis of the shifted center of gravity. But this time, the footprint was deeper than the one he had seen during the escape. This meant that Vlasov was not only walking fast, but also carrying a heavy load. He was carrying tools, Shadow, and most likely explosives. He didn't come here to dig. He came here to destroy. Voron moved forward, his eyes scanning every inch of ground, every leaf, every branch. Unlike European detectives who were looking for evidence, Voron was looking for the logic of despair. He noticed that Vlasov had veered off the path several times to catch his breath. By an old fallen cedar tree, Raven found a barely noticeable trail. The moss had been flattened not by a heel, but by a knee. "He fell," Voron said quietly. "He fell from exhaustion, but he got up. Greed won't let him stop." Near the cedar tree, Raven discovered another, more personal sign. An unfinished bottle of cheap mineral water that Vlasov had thrown away, carelessly kicking it aside. There was a trace of southern tobacco on the neck, which Raven had already identified. But in addition to this, there was a small scratch on the bottle, apparently made with a sharp object. Voron took out his knife, crouched down, and carefully examined the scratch. It was shallow, but sharp. He was cleaning his nails, Voron concluded, or more likely, calibrating the diagram. Ivan Andreevich knew that a canvas diagram developed with chemicals could be inaccurate. As an engineer, Vlasov could not rely solely on chemistry. He used something sharp, perhaps the corner of a metal plate on his belt or even his ring, to make the final, precise marks on the diagram, checking it against the terrain. This action spoke of his obsession with the truth. He had to be sure that he had found exactly the right place. Voron looked up at the sky. The sun was rising. He had less than an hour before Vlasov reached the gorge. If Vlasov managed to plant the explosives and stake out the territory, it could become an irreversible act that would attract hundreds of people here. The shadow suddenly stopped abruptly, her body tensing. She let out a low, guttural growl, directed not at Raven, but forward, toward the top of the pass. A smell. Voron approached her, putting his finger to his lips. Quiet, Shadow. There, ahead, behind the boulder, Raven saw a new, very fresh trail.
It was not trampled moss, but disturbed air. And he caught a faint, sharp smell of ammonia and damp gunpowder. "There you are, Vlasov," Raven whispered. This trail spoke of a last desperate rush. Vlasov was close to his goal. He must have been tired, but his obsession drove him forward. He was no longer exercising the caution he had shown even when escaping from the artel. There was no fear in his movements now, only mad determination. He wasn't hiding. He was charging ahead like a tank, ignoring the broken branches and trampled moss. Without hesitation, Raven turned off the trail. He couldn't afford to follow in his footsteps, as Vlasov could probably have set up a tripwire on the trail. Another sign of his engineering mind and paranoid fear. Voron and Shadow walked along the ridge, moving parallel to each other, using their knowledge of the terrain, which Vlasov, having spent years in European offices, had long since lost. Finally, they came to the last spur, which offered a view of the gorge. The scene Raven saw was the culmination of his remote investigation. Vlasov. He was kneeling, his hands clutching a detonator and a diagram. Near him, on the ground, were scattered tools. A crowbar, a shovel, bags of explosives. He had already found the entrance and was preparing to open or close it forever. Voron was struck by how the hustle and bustle of the city and greed had disfigured this man. His face was marred by stubble, his eyes feverishly shining. He looked like a vagrant, like a sick individual who needed to be removed. Voron stood up. His silhouette, carved against the morning sky, instantly caught Vlasov's attention. The engineer raised his head sharply, his eyes full of mad triumph meeting Voron's calm, heavy gaze. "You're too late, Belov," Vlasov croaked, his voice broken, full of hatred. "You've returned to the scene of the crime, Vlasov," Voron replied, his voice low and steady, like the rumble of a mountain river. "And you've brought disease with you." Vlasov clutched the detonator, ready to press the button to blow up the entrance, and possibly himself, just so he wouldn't have to give Voron his prize, and could take revenge by destroying the sacred place. But Voron knew that his opponent would not kill himself. Greed would not allow him to die while the gold was so close. And now that they had met, the hunt had finally ceased to be remote and had become physical. Voron took the first step down toward the gorge, ready to restore the disturbed balance. It was the last ambush. The tension in the narrow gorge, squeezed between rocky spurs, became almost physically palpable, dense as mountain fog. Andrei Vlasov, exhausted by many days of running and obsession, looked at Ivan Andreevich Belov with that mixture of horror and rage that arises in a beast driven into a corner. Vlasov was on his knees, his hands clutching two objects: a rolled-up canvas map, which was now his only religion, and a small but deadly detonator, connected by wires to the charge he had managed to plant at the entrance to the ancient mine. "You're too late, Belov," Vlasov croaked, his voice tinged with the metallic rasp of exhaustion. "I know it's you. You always show up at the end. You ruin other people's lives, Belov." "You ruined mine!" The raven slowly climbed down from the rock, his boots making no sound. The shadow, keeping its distance, took up a position, crouching, ready to pounce if its master gave the signal. In the silence, broken only by gusts of wind, Raven seemed to be the embodiment of the Taiga itself, unshakable, ancient, and utterly ruthless
to those who broke its laws. I didn't ruin your life, Vlasov. Raven replied in an even, low voice.
You ruined it yourself. You put greed above the law. You came here to steal not only wealth, but also the silence of this place.
Vlasov laughed, and it was a hysterical, insane laugh. Peace! What peace, Raven? I was sitting in a cage while you were playing the philosopher here. You took everything from me, my wife, my name, my career. And this gold, he pointed toward the mine entrance. This gold will give me everything back.
And I'll make sure you see your precious world collapse.
Vlasov raised the detonator. His finger rested on the button. If you take another step, I'll blow up the entrance. And I'll bury you, Belov, right here, in this
sacred ground of yours.
Voron stopped. He didn't move, but his gaze, heavy as granite, penetrated straight into Vlasov's consciousness.
You won't blow it up, said Voron with absolute certainty.
Vlasov flinched. His hand trembled. Why do you think that? Because I'm afraid of death? No. I'm afraid of being left with nothing. I'll press it. You won't press it because you're greedy, Vlasov, explained Voron, each word striking a blow to the engineer's psyche. If you blow up the entrance, you'll bury the diagram. You will destroy the last piece of information, and you will die knowing that all your efforts, London, Paris, Vienna, fleeing halfway across the world, were in vain. You won't even find out how much gold is there. You, an engineer who has valued precision all your life, will not destroy the truth at the last moment. Voron struck Vlasov's most painful spot, his obsession with control and absolute information.
Andrei Vlasov, who was so proud of his calculations, now faced the fact that his revenge would nullify his only prize.
Vlasov hesitated. His finger moved slightly away from the button. Raven did not hesitate, taking advantage of this momentary lapse. The painting you stole is just a key. Real wealth isn't in gold, Vlasov. It's in order. And you broke that order. You think you're the smartest. You planted a false scheme to distract us. You think you got your revenge by leaving your ring behind, but you only left traces of your greed.
The raven stepped forward. The shadow growled quietly, ready for the command. If you press it, your plan will remain a secret forever.
Your revenge will not achieve its goal, because I will close this place anyway. But if you don't press it, then you will have a chance to at least tell your truth. My truth? Vlasov looked hunted. You want me to tell you how I found it? How I found out about the bunker? How I planned this for 10 years while you enjoyed your Taiga? Yes, because your story is also a trace. Vlasov, unable to resist the pressure and unwilling to destroy the information, slowly lowered his hand. The detonator fell from his fingers and hit the stone with a dull thud. The canvas diagram fell nearby. Voron instantly signaled to the shadow. The dog, moving at lightning speed, jumped, not at Vlasov but at the detonator, pressing it to the ground with his paw, preventing it from being accidentally pressed. Good dog, said Raven, keeping his eyes on Vlasov. Raven approached the former engineer. Vlasov sat on the ground, his shoulders slumped.
There was no anger or fear left in him, only absolute, devastating defeat. "How did you find me?" Vlasov asked, his voice now quiet, almost childlike.
"Through your mistakes," Raven replied calmly. "You left your southern tobacco. You left your ring. You left a false diagram in a place that is personal to me. You left too many personal traces. You thought revenge would hide your greed, but it only made it obvious. You are a sick individual, Vlasov. You have upset the balance."
The Raven bent down and picked up the rolled-up canvas.
Now, under a layer of clear varnish, a topographical map was clearly visible. The real diagram. The gold vein that Vlasov had dreamed of. You knew the laws of the Taiga, Andrei. You knew that you couldn't take more than you could carry without harming the whole. But you decided to take everything. And now, you will get nothing.
Vlasov began to cry, dry, silent sobs of a hunted man.
"I only wanted justice, Ivan."
You destroyed my project, my life. You handed me over to the city laws.
"I didn't hand you over to the law, but to the consequences of your actions," replied Voron, his voice unmoved. "And now they have caught up with you here."
My justice is the restoration of order. Voron carefully defused the explosive charge by pulling the main wire out of the detonator, which Shadow was still holding. He knew he shouldn't kill him. He had to remove him from the ecosystem. That was his rule. He took out a strong rope that he always carried in his backpack. Vlasov did not resist. His obsession had evaporated, leaving behind only fatigue and the realization of failure. "The painting," Vlasov whispered, looking at the canvas in Voron's hands. "What will you do with it?" Voron looked at the diagram, at the lines that promised untold riches, but carried the threat of destruction. "I won't sell it or give it to the government," said Voron. "Otherwise, others will come here, and the balance will be disrupted. The painting was bait, and bait must be destroyed." Voron stepped aside. He picked up a stone and carefully but firmly pierced the canvas in several places to make the information unreadable, tearing the topographical lines. Then he folded the map several times. The gold vein remained untouched. The silence of the taiga was preserved. He tied Vlasov to an old cedar tree, leaving him in the gorge. "Shadow, guard him," Voron ordered, and the dog obediently sat down next to the prisoner. Voron took out the satellite phone he had left at the pass and sent Mayorov a short, urgent message with the exact coordinates of the gorge. "I have Vlasov. He's alive. Send a helicopter. 1. And don't forget about the city laws, Lieutenant. He'll need them here." He turned off the phone again and returned to Vlasov. The sun was already high in the sky.
"This isn't the end, Vlasov," said Voron. "This is atonement. You will answer according to the law of men."
"And I will return to erase all traces of you and restore silence." He sat down on a rock and waited for the helicopter, looking at his prisoner. There was no triumph in Voron's eyes, only quiet, philosophical sadness. He knew that he had defeated not a man, but his greed, and it was a victory that cost him much more than any royal treasure. After Andrei Vlasov, broken and devastated, released the detonator, the tension in the gorge did not disappear. It simply changed its nature. Instead of the threat of an explosion, there was a heavy, unbearable silence, full of awareness and consequences. Vlasov, sitting on the cold ground,
tied with a strong rope, looked at Voron not with hatred, but with hopeless, almost childish bewilderment. He could not understand how his carefully planned revenge, his multi-stage European scheme, had collapsed before a man who had never left the Taiga. Voron finished neutralizing the explosives, pulling the wires out of the charge and folding them into a neat bundle. He worked methodically, without fuss, as if he were doing his usual firewood preparation. "You left me no choice, Vlasov," Raven said quietly, looking at the place where the entrance to the Tsar's mine was hidden under the rocks. "You made me follow you halfway across the world without leaving my place, and you made me realize that your greed knows no bounds." "It's not greed, it's justice," Vlasov replied hoarsely, trying to give his voice its former firmness. But all he could manage was a painful groan. "You took everything from me. Your Taiga, your laws. You were always right." "I've always been honest," Raven corrected him. "And you've always been obsessed. Obsessed not with gold, but with the right to break the rules. I didn't destroy your life, Andrei. I didn't let you destroy the lives of others. And you, knowing how I feel about this place, came back to kill him. And that is your sentence." Raven picked up the crumpled canvas from the ground. The diagram, partially destroyed by Raven, still contained some information that could be recovered. He sat down on a rock, holding the canvas in his hands. "The painting was your key to legalization, and for me, it became the key to the truth," said Raven, running his finger over the rough canvas. He took out his hunting knife. The shadow lying next to Vlasov raised its head, as if sensing the decisive moment. Vlasov looked at the knife with horror. "What are you doing? Kill me. You don't need me anymore," Vlasov shouted. "The law of the Taiga does not require blood, Vlasov. It requires order," replied Raven. He began to carefully but irrevocably cut the canvas, not just tearing it, but methodically cutting out sections, containing key topographical marks and chemical symbols. With each cut, with each line destroyed, the promise of untold wealth melted away. Vlasov, who seemed to have resigned himself to his fate, flew into a rage as he saw his only hope being destroyed. "Don't you dare! This is mine, my life, my gold!" he shouted, trying to break free from the ropes, but they were tied with an iron hand that knew how to tie knots that even the strongest beast could not cut. "This is not your gold," Raven said calmly, cutting off the last corner piece of the diagram. "This is bait, and now it is destroyed." When Raven finished, all that remained of the diagram was a set of meaningless, scattered fragments of no value. The canvas that was supposed to trigger an international scandal and the destruction of the Taiga had turned into nothing. Balance had been restored. The Tsar's gold or artifacts remained hidden deep within the mountain forever. "I am removing you from the ecosystem, Vlasov," said Voron, hiding the knife. "You are a sick individual who threatened the whole. Now you are just a man who broke the law." He left Vlasov tied to the cedar tree. The shadow remained nearby, its presence the best guarantee that the prisoner would not escape before the city folk arrived. Voron walked away from the gorge, but not to his backpack and satellite phone. He followed Vlasov's trail back. His inner code demanded not only the elimination of the threat, but also purification. He had to erase all traces of Vlasov's presence, from the trampled moss to the smell of gunpowder and tobacco. He had to make sure that no future treasure hunter, no curious person, would find the slightest hint of what had happened here. He methodically examined the trail Vlasov had just taken. He smoothed out the trampled moss, pulled up the torn roots, and covered the remains of southern tobacco with earth. He removed the wrappers and the bottle. He even erased his own tracks, which he had left behind during the pursuit. It was hard, meditative work that brought him back to a state of absolute silence and peace. When Raven reached the spot where Vlasov had tripped over a cedar stump, he stopped. He did not try to restore the broken branch. It was impossible, but he covered the spot where the trace of his fall remained with earth and pine needles. He worked like this for several hours. When he returned to the pass, he saw a distant dot in the sky that was rapidly growing larger. Mayorov's helicopter.
Voron took a satellite phone from under a rock, which seemed foreign and dirty in his clean hands, and gave Mayorov final confirmation. He returned to the gorge. Vlasov, seeing the helicopter, raised his head.
His eyes flashed with hope for city justice, lawyers, and deals. He saw the approaching helicopter not as punishment, but as salvation. Voron, you did it. You brought me back to civilization, he shouted. Voron untied the ropes, leaving them neatly folded. He stepped aside, not looking at Vlasov. I brought you back to the law, Vlasov. Now, you're their problem. When the helicopter landed, Mayorov and two men in uniform hurried toward them. Mayorov, seeing Raven, was about to begin a speech of gratitude, but Raven raised his hand, interrupting him. The threat has been neutralized. The criminal is here, he said, looking at Mayorov with undisguised contempt. The painting, which was a blueprint, has been destroyed. There is no information. My work is done. Voron handed Mayorov the crumpled, torn diagram. The lieutenant took it with confusion. But Ivan Andreevich, the value is silence. I have restored it. You are here to take away a sick individual. Voron cut him off. And don't leave any trash behind. This is my territory. Without waiting for thanks, questions, or even an exchange of glances with Vlasov, who was already in handcuffs, Voron turned away and walked off. The shadow followed him. He left it to the city folk to deal with their problems and their laws. His work was clean and complete. He had restored order, and now his final mission was to cover his tracks. After Mayorov's helicopter, knocking down the tops of the pine trees with its propellers, rose heavily into the air, carrying away the bound Andrei Vlasov and the sealed evidence, useless fragments of the diagram. The Raven remained in the gorge. The acrid smell of kerosene, mixed with the smell of mountain smoke, was the only thing that reminded him of the alien invasion. He stood leaning on the butt of his rifle and watched the receding machine, which looked like a small, noisy dot returning to its world. His work was done. According to human law. Before boarding, Mayorov tried to talk about a reward, about gratitude from the very top, about the need to testify. But Voron cut him off with a single heavy glance. I've already given my testimony. Vlasov is your problem. The plan has been destroyed. Go, he said then. There was so much contempt for this fussy, bureaucratic justice in his voice that the lieutenant didn't dare to argue. Voron refused everything. Money, praise, hero status. For him, these things were empty shells. His goal was not revenge or recognition. His goal
was to restore balance. And now that the sick individual had been removed from the ecosystem, the most important, most sacred part of his work remained: cleaning up the trail. He started with the gorge.
This place, where Vlasov had experienced the peak of his greed and downfall, had to be erased from the memory of the earth.
The Raven methodically collected all the trash left behind by the engineer. Cigarette butts, scraps of insulation, empty explosive containers.
He didn't just throw them into a bag. He carefully burned the organic remains and carefully packed the inorganic ones to take with him. He even used a handful of clean soil to cover the places where Vlasov's feet had stood, mixing it with untouched moss. His gaze, always so attentive, was now focused not on searching, but on removing. He examined every stone to make sure that no microscopic clue would remain here and attract other, more greedy hunters in the future.
The Tsar's gold, or artifacts, remained forever dormant in the bowels of the mountain, and Voron was their sole, unspoken guardian. He retraced the entire path that Vlasov had taken to the gorge, moving in the opposite direction. Covering tracks is an art that Raven had honed over years of living in the Taiga. It was like meditation, like returning to one's roots, when you don't create history, but erase it, leaving only silence behind.
He smoothed out the trampled grass and pulled up twigs so that they looked naturally broken, not crushed by a boot. He even carried away small stones that could have been moved from their place. When he reached the pass where he had left his backpack, the sun was already high in the sky, piercing the forest with golden rays.
Voron sat down on a boulder, feeling his fatigue melt away, replaced by a sense of deep, almost philosophical satisfaction.
He had won, not through cunning, but through understanding the laws of nature, which always prove stronger than the laws invented by humans. He knew that Vlasov was facing a long trial and then years of imprisonment.
Both were part of urban justice, which was of no importance to the Raven. What mattered was that the threat to the balance had been eliminated. Voron took the remains of the twisted canvas diagram out of his backpack and cut it up.
He spread the pieces out on a rock. It was a fragile, yellowed material, once known as the Tsaritsa's tear and the key to untold riches. Now it was just trash. He took a flint and tinder, lit a small, quick fire, and carefully burned the fragments of canvas. He scattered the ashes, thin and grey, into the wind so that they would dissolve into the air and become part of the earth. The painting, lost and found, was gone forever. Then Raven went to the hut. The shadow walked beside him, its steps as silent and light as those of its master.
The world around them was clean again, the smells of kerosene and gunpowder gone,
replaced by the resinous scent of pine trees and the freshness of mountain water. The taiga seemed to breathe deeply, freed from the alien presence.
Returning to his hut, Raven stood by the fire for a long time, watching the smoke rise into the sky. He felt neither pride nor triumph, only a quiet sadness that always accompanies the realization of human weakness and greed. He knew that his victory was not absolute. Human nature would always find a way to try to upset the balance again. But he had done what he had to do. He had defended his territory. He took his old hunting knife and began to clean it. The knife was clean, but Raven polished it with the same care with which he had erased Vlasov's traces. It was a ritual that reinforced order. Raven was convinced that the sick individual had been removed. Vlasov, Platov, European auctions. It was all part of one destructive system, and his role in this world was unchanged. To be Raven, the one who sees more than others, and the one who restores justice when human law proves powerless. He looked up at the sky. High above the cedars, a large bird of prey was slowly circling.
A raven. He looked at it, and his eyes reflected the calm, austere beauty of his world. His story was over, but his service was not.
He returned to his hut, ready for the moment when he would once again have to read the signs, on the ground, on paper, or in a person's soul, to restore the stolen silence.